Hashem, today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Ayin Aleph, Zevachim 71. Today's daf, we begin the 8th chapter of Mesechus Zevachim, and from this point on, each chapter is its own independent unit, and this chapter is technically titled Kol Zevachim, but amongst the Rishonim, they call it Perek HaTaruvos, and that's because this chapter deals with mixtures where the korban gets mixed in or the meat gets mixed in. Parts of the animal get mixed in with other parts. So the Mishnah, that's called the tarovos, a mixture. So the Mishnah begins by saying, any korban which gets mixed up with chatos amesos. There's 5 chatos that have this law, 5 sin offerings that have the law that they have to be put to death. It's halacha Moshe Sinai. And the way we remember it is vitimna. The vitimna is the pilegesh of Esav, and the mnemonic to remember it is vitimna. The vav stands for the blood, the offspring of a chatos that has to be allowed to die. The tamura, an animal that was exchanged with a chatos. The chatos, shemesu bala, the chatos whose owner died, and so therefore there's nobody for whom it can atone for. 4th is a chatos shenevda, a chatos that was lost, and so therefore, and when it was discovered, it had a blemish on it. Or also an animal chatas that got a blemish on its owner is a different animal, and also a chatas that was more than a year old. So all these cases are what's called the timna. These are the chatas that you have to allow them to die. So and even though from our Mishnah it sounds like one kosher korban got mixed up with all the chatas mesos, really the Gemara is going to explain that the Mishnah really means one of these animals that is a chatas that's supposed to die got mixed up with the karbanos. So in that case, there's no solution. Oh, Bishor and Iskal, or if it got mixed up with an ox that's supposed to be stoned to death. I feel achas beribo, even one in 10,000. Yamusuku, and they all have to die. Rashi says, Hashta mashmas achas ksher beribo shachatas ameson. Okay, I explained this already. That Rashi says now we even refer to where there was one kosher animal that got mixed up with 1,000, or 10,000 that are supposed to die. The Gemara is going to ask, what does that mean? And the Gemara is going to explain that actually the way to understand the Mishnah is the opposite. So in this case, since these animals cannot be redeemed, they have to be allowed to die. Therefore, you have to allow all the animals to die. You can't redeem them. But says the next case of the Mishnah, Kuan isarvu bishor shenev deboaver. Let's say what was mixed in with what was a taruvos? Taruvos was not a chatos amesos, which have to die, but an animal which a sin was done with it. In which case, the animal, once it has a blemish on it, then we could redeem the kosher animal, and that animal that a sin was done with it, not prohibited to have benefit. It's just prohibited to be brought as a korban. So therefore, what's the example of these cases? Oh, really? It could go like, for example, Shehemi says Adam, if this was an animal that killed a person, but there's only one witness, so we can't stone it to death. Or the owner testified, and so therefore that's not enough to put the animal to death. We'll see why. Or the animal was engaged in a sexual act with a human being. Or the animal was set aside for idolatry. Or if the animal was worshipped for idolatry, or be'asnan, this is an animal that was exchanged that was received for the work of a harlot. Umachir, an animal is exchanged for a dog. Beklayim ubetrefa, or if the animal was klayim, meaning it was an offspring of 2 different species of animals, or if the animal was a treifa, therefore it's not able to be brought as a korban. Ubiyotzi dofen, or if the animal was a C-section. In all these cases, Yiroachi Yistadol V'imkiru. You have to wait until the animal gets a blemish and then you sell it. V'yavi b'dmei yafa shebem meosamin. So you wait until both these animals, all the animals there get a blemish because you don't know which one is which. And then you sell the you redeem all basically they're all able to be redeemed. And then you take the animal that is the most expensive and you buy from that animal, the value of that animal, another korban. And that way, in that case, you're making sure that the animal that was originally, in case that was the most expensive one, then you at least bring that one for the korban. Go back to the Rashi here. Rashi says nisar vos Zevachim ksherim, that the animal that was a kosher korban got mixed up. Here we're talking about 1 and 1, just 2 animals. It doesn't have to be 1,000. And the Gemara is going to explain what are these cases. That says the Mishnah. What are these cases? Keep going. So our Mishnah is not an or, but it's like, for example, shehemis es adam. Like, for example, if it killed a person, but there was only one witness to that effect, or on the basis of the owner's testimony. Why? The Shorshe Misapia Balam Rashi says if there was an ox that killed on the basis of the owner's testimony, if there were a miskila, then under those circumstances, it's exempt from stoning. And Rashi here is a little bit controversial because he says this is an example of modeh b'knas upater. It's an example of where you're admitting to the penalty. Therefore, since you admit to the penalty, it's going to be exempt. Also, if the animal is engaged in a sexual act on the basis of one witness or on the basis of the owners, because then it's not an axe that's stoned to death. And we can't say that the animal should die. Why don't we say that in this second case of the Mishnah that the animal should die? Because these animals are allowed to be used even though they're engaged in this sexual act. There's only one witness, so a non-sacred purpose can use them. But there's a korban that's mixed in with them, so you can't use it. So you can't sell them and say, okay, these are all going to be animals that are brought as a korban for this specific type of animal, because the animal can't be brought. So because one of them is an animal that a sin was done with it, so it can't be brought. Like we say in Tamura, you can't use an animal that was worshipped even with one witness. So therefore, what do you have to do under these circumstances? So therefore, under these circumstances, what you have to do is you have to wait for them to get a blemish, and then once they get the blemish, then Yirachi Yistavo, they graze until they get a blemish. And we'll look at the Rashi on Ayin Aleph from the base. The Machmas says Zevachim, because as a result of the offering that's mixed in with them, Nesru Kuon Lahejot, then all of them become prohibited to be used by a regular person. And you can't just deconsecrate it before it has a blemish. That's impossible, because an animal korban cannot be redeemed until it gets a blemish. Therefore, what you have to do is you have to let it graze until it becomes blemished. And you have to bring from the most expensive, the one of those animals that was the most expensive. Also korban, and so therefore you take the most expensive of one of those animals and purchase with it for the same type of offering. If it's an olah, you have to bring the money and to buy an olah, because it may be the animal that was the nicest was the olah. And you say wherever this and when he does it, he says kol makom shehu azevach yemchu. He says wherever the korban will be deconsecrated onto this money, and then you bring from that money an olah, or if it's a shlomim, a shlomim. So therefore, that's what you do, and everything is solved. But nisarvu, next case, nisarvim bechulin tamimim. Let's say it didn't get mixed up with an animal that had done a sin, but it got mixed up with a chulin tamimim, which is non-sacred animals, but they don't have a blemish on them. So then yimkura chulin utzorche ose amin. So then what you have to do is you can sell all the chulin animals for the purposes of that korban. So, and then you bring them on a tanai. So let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Nisar v'bechulin tamimim." Oh, echad be'echad, oh zevach echad b'chulin. Let's say it's one animal mixed with another animal, or one animal with many animals. Yimkru kol chulin. You sell all the chulin animals, all the non-sacred animals. Let's say there are two sacred animals that got mixed up with the korban, and we don't know which is which. So sell all the animals, all the chulins, for that type of korban. Lamin oso a korban. Meaning to say, you sell them to be used as a korban. So now we have three animals there. So you sell two for the purpose of that korban. All right, kuon kachim shalmin echad. So now we have three animals that are all kachim. Kuon kachim shalmin echad. We just don't know which one is each animal. And then when you bring each one, you say it's for whoever the owner is. Whichever owner is the owner of this, that's the one that's going for. Kachim and kachim. If you got mixed up with other kachim, let's say the oa got mixed up with another oa, so then if it's the same type of animal, then both of them are brought. When you bring them all, you say whoever this one is for, this is being brought. It's brought on a stipulation. It's no problem. So that's that. You don't have to do anything except when you bring the offering, you bring it on a stipulation. But kachim in b'she'eno, let's say you get an oa mixed up with a shlamim. So then what are you supposed to do? Then you let it graze until it gets a blemish. V'yimkeru, and then you sell them. V'yavi b'dmei hayafa shebahem miminzeh, b'dmei hayafa shebahem miminzeh. V'yav sedamosar mibeso. Basically, then under those circumstances, you have to wait till they get a blemish, and then you redeem them all, and for the more, and then once you redeem them all, you have to bring for the most expensive one of them for each of the offerings, because maybe that one was that offering. You want to make sure that the hektish doesn't get shortchanged, but in that context, you're going to be the one who loses the money. So, okay, the next case, nisarvu bebechor ubemaiser. Let's say it got mixed up with a firstborn animal. The bechor is something that we've already learned has to be brought as a korban, and if it's a kohen, if it gets a blemish, and the kohen could eat it, but it cannot be redeemed. And also the meiser was also an animal that the 10th animal you have to bring and brought as an offering, but it also can't be redeemed. So under these circumstances, you have to wait for them to get a blemish, and then you take the money from his home, and he says, wherever this korban or shlamim is, it should be mechul on this money, and then the or shlamim goes out to chulin, and so therefore we now have a case that the chulin and the bechor or the meiser is mixed up, but you're allowed to eat the bechor or the meiser, but there's certain halachic limitations on it. So under those circumstances, then it's eating like the bechor and the meiser. And so that's the way it goes. So look at Rashi. We'll just read the Rashi on this case here. Nisaru bechor meiser yirachi istavu. V'yavi Rashi says. Okay, let's go back one. Nisaru Zevachim could go an ola bebechor. Let's say offering like an ola or got mixed up with a bechor or b'meiser. She'ein tosin demand b'kedusha. That basically you're not allowed to redeem them. And you can't bring them together as an offering. Why? You can't bring them because the oil is supposed to be burnt and the bechor is supposed to be in. Or even if it was a shlamim, Rashi says one requires four applications and one requires one. And also smicha tzachim. So we have differences of the laws. So there you have to leave them until they graze. V'yavi b'dmei, Rashi says, v'yavi mois b'dmei yafa, and then you have to bring money from the more expensive animal and say wherever kol makom shehu hazevach hatofes istama v'yimchu al mois halohu. And you say wherever is this korban that can be redeemed is deconsecrated to this money. And so now it's a chulin that is mixed up with a bechor or a meiser, and so that has a blemish, but the bechor and the meiser have a blemish. And so therefore they could be mixed up all under the law of Bechor Ma'aser Bali Mumim. What is the law? Shelo Yishchatu Ba'atlas, that you're not allowed to sell it in the market, and there's certain limitations the way it's sold, so it's not sold in a disrespectful manner. So, okay, the Rashi talks about maybe there's a limitation on hektish. Okay, that's the point. Now, good morning, Jeff. So now the last line of the Mishnah is Hakol Yechol Asariv, and this is just a almost irrelevant, but almost not irrelevant, but not directly on point. I think we're going to have to discuss why it's here. Kol Yechol Asariv, all the animals could be mixed up, Chutz min Achatos ve'Asham, except for the Achatos and Asham, because there clearly you can always tell the difference between a Chatos and an Asham, because the Chatos never comes from the ram, and the Asham always comes from the ram. So therefore, you can always tell which one is which, so the Chatas can never get mixed up. Okay, so now the Gemara goes back and makes a point, which, because I already done the daf, I made it at the very beginning. What does it mean, Maya Philo? What does it mean that even if the way we first would read our Mishnah is if even one kosher carbon got mixed up with 10,000 chatos that are supposed to die, we have to let them all die. What do you mean even with 10,000? It should be for sure if even one, but for sure if it got mixed up with 10,000. So Gemara says, yeah, we're reading the Mishnah wrong. This is how you have to read the Mishnah. If you have a carbon and a chatos, even one chatos that was supposed to die got mixed up with your carbon, shor and isko, or one ox that was supposed to be stoned got mixed up with your carbon, I feel even 1 in 10,000, yamusukun, they all have to die. Why do the laws of bittul not work here? Why do the laws of nullification not work here? So that commentaries discuss that either because it's something that's called a davar chashav, it's something that is very distinguished animal, or maybe it's because it is something that is Baalei Chayim, it's a living animal. But anyway, there are different theories amongst Rishonim why the laws of nullification don't apply here, but they clearly don't apply. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second, we have another question. Why does our Mishnah have to say this? Why do we even need this Mishnah? Tanina Charazimna. We have another Mishnah in Mesechas Tamura, God willing we'll get to, as part of our Daf Yomi. It's a beautiful tractate where we learn the exact same idea, where it says there, so it says there that anything that's prohibited if it goes on the altar, they are going to be prohibiting in any amount. Like, for example, the rovei and the neighbor, which are prohibited to go on the altar, if they get mixed up, even with a carbon, then they're all going to be prohibited. So we have the same idea here. So why is it repeated twice? So Amar Avashi, Amrisa L'Shmaita Kamed Rav Shimi. He said, I said this basic teaching in front of Rav Shimi about Tzrechinon. And he says, there's a distinction between the two Mishnayos. Hasam, there in the Mishnah in Tamura, Hasam, I might have said that when do we say this case? That is when they're all mixed up for Kulan Hamas Arvin Asur Gvoa, Mutar Hejot, Berio Padilla. Rashi says, Lo Iri Hasam and Miss Arvu be Surehana. So Rashi says, if we just had that case there, I would have said that which the rabbis were strict, and they said that there's no nullification by the laws of Kodshim. That's only specifically when the animals are prohibited only for the temple. Like, for example, the rovei and the nirba, the animals that engage in bestiality, that you're not allowed to have any benefit from them. And so therefore the sages said that you cannot, that they're not nullified. But on that case, because it's prohibited with voa, but it's permitted, but there's at least some permission there that you could use it for non-sacred purposes. It's not prohibited to have benefit at all. It's just prohibited for the temple. Avo, so therefore, but if there's something that's completely prohibited, like the case of the chatos and mesos, that they have to die, Imalo, I might have said, well, there, since it's so severe and there's no other use for it, then we're going to say that it is actually nullified, because since there's no allowance for it at all, we have no choice because we don't want them to all die. So therefore, we'll say that it could be used. It could be nullified. We might have thought that nullification only doesn't apply when there's another use for it, like being used for a regular offering. But in the case where there's no other use for it, then we would say, okay, the nullification applies. So that's what our mission is adding on, even the case of chatos amesos, which is prohibited to everyone, not just for the temple. And if we just had our Mishnah here and we didn't have the Mishnah in Tmura, Havamina Hani Udi Sure Hananinu, then I would have said, if we just had our Mishnah that says the case of Chatos Amesis and Shor and Niskol, I would say that these are the ones that are not nullified. These Sure Hananinu, because these are completely prohibitive benefits, a much more severe prohibition of Ohani, but in the case of where it's prohibited only for the temple, but it's not prohibited to have benefit in general, Amolo, I might have said that they're not, that they are nullified. So we need both cases because the lavis so therefore we need both cases. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? So what are you talking about that our Mishnah is only talking about those cases that are completely prohibited to have benefit, like the chatos amesos? The Gemara says, what are you talking about? Says the Gemara, the lavi surya. What do you mean that they're not prohibited to have benefit? But didn't we learned in our Mishnah the case of where they are not prohibited to have benefit, i.e., the case of the case of the Rova and the Nirva, and all these ones that are just prohibited to be brought in the temple, but they are permitted to have benefit from them. So yeah. So the Gemara says, yeah, we did. It is in fact the case that we did have that case. We do have the second clause in the Mishnah which talks about those animals which are not prohibited to have benefit. But mikatani bekama, did the Mishnah talk about there how many were mixed in? In the first case, it said even 1 in 1,000. Kol shehin hasam katani. But the Mishnah in Tmura talks about exactly the amount, even any amount. B'kol shehin hasam. But our Mishnah here doesn't talk about the ratio, whereas the Mishnah in Tmura does talk about the ratio. There in the Mishnah Tmura it says osir b'kol shehin, but our Mishnah didn't make that point that it's any amount. So we might have thought that they were nullified. And so therefore we need both. We need first case of chatos amesos because the Mishnah in Tmura didn't talk about where it's completely nullified. And our Mishnah here, even about the ones that are not prohibited to have benefits from, it doesn't give the ratio when it says that they're not nullified, whereas the Mishnah in Tmura says any amount are not nullified. Tmura says, well, why did our Mishnah just say that here? Why didn't our Mishnah just say those words? Say those words that they're not, even when it's something that's not prohibited to have benefit, it's never nullified. It could have just said our case here, and or Vinisniya, you could have learned the Mishnah in Tmura and V'lo Baya. So the Gemara's question actually is, well, we don't need our Mishnah at all. It's not adding anything to the discussion. The Mishnah in Tmura says that it's never nullified, even if something that's not prohibited to have benefit from it. But then, why do we need our Mishnah to mention it? So the Gemara says, yeah, I'll tell you why we need a takanta tzricha. Our Mishnah here gives a takana. It tells us how you allow it to be used, that you basically allow it to get a blemish, and then you bring and you redeem the most expensive, you buy an animal with the most expensive one of those animals, and that's how you're able to get a redeem. And so therefore, since our Mishnah is the one that says the takana, therefore it's supposed to be mentioned. So hold on one second. So now the Gemara says, Dehejo nami tanila. So the Gemara says, how can we say that the Chiddush in the first clause of our Mishnah is that the sages were not lenient even in a circumstance where it's never nullified and they all have to die? If the animal is a hedjo, meaning to say, the second clause of the Mishnah, that even if the animal, that an animal that's only prohibited to have benefit, this concept that an animal that's prohibited to have benefit is going to be completely not able to be nullified. This idea that something that's prohibited to have benefit is also not nullified is also taught in another Mishnah. Meaning, say not just the Mishnah, not just the second cause is taught in the Mishnah tomorrow, but even the first cause that it's not nullified, that's also taught elsewhere. Where do we learn this? We already learned this in Tractate Avodah Zarah, where it states V'elu asurin v'osrin b'kol shein. These are the things that are prohibited, and they prohibit with any amount. What are the things that are prohibited with any amount? Yain netzech v'avodas kachavim. This is the wine that's idolatrous wine and idolatry, since that they are prohibited to have any benefit, and still we say they're not nullified. So we already have this teaching that something that's completely prohibited to have benefit is still never nullified. So what, in fact, is our Mishnah adding on? So the Gemara says, "Tzricha on top of Ayin Beis of an Aleph." We need both cases. The may also, if you just had the case in about Yain Nesach and Avodah Zarah, Havamini Hani Mili Chulin. I would say, when do we say Havi Amini Lahejod or Chulin? When do we say it's not nullified? If it's for Chulin. But for the temple property, I might say that we can nullify it. Why? Because we don't want to lose everything completely for Kachim. So for Kachim, we might have thought only for Chulin is it never nullified. But for Kachim, we might say that there's a takana. So basically, they'll graze and then you redeem them. But the me'acha, and also where's the opposite? If we just had the case of kachim, kachim demayis. When do we say it's never nullified? By kachim, because it's repulsive to bring an animal that's repulsive to God when it's mixed in with those that are prohibited to have benefit. Of a chulin, the lamayis, but chulin, we don't care if it's repulsive because it's not for God. He might have thought it's nullified in majority. So therefore, we need both cases. Okay, so that's today's daf. Beautiful daf. Baruch Hashem. We'll stop the recording here. Actually, but we